Kia ora, Parklands Baptist. It was a great surf on Wednesday. I live close enough to the beach that I can go for a walk along the beach, which is lovely, but it was a great surf on Wednesday, and I stood with my feet in the sand, looking out at the waves. I was on the beach, but I wanted to be somewhere else. Had a little look round on the sand dunes, and sure enough, there were a bunch of surfer wannabes, standing in one place, wishing they were in another. There's a little bit of that to our current existence, isn't there? Here we are in level 4, confined to our homes, in our bubbles, but kind of longing to be somewhere else, waiting for change. We are here, but we want to be there. And the truth is that level 3 will look great, but not really where we want to be. It's the next stage of quite a long journey. We might get to have slightly bigger bubbles, and more of us will be able to work, but gathered church isn't coming for a fair while. We haven't done this before. We're not at the end, more like the end of the beginning. There's still a fair way to go. So well done all of you who've been staying home and washing your hands and making fun together and caring for ourselves, because it matters. But we're not there yet. A little bit like my surfing. Actually, level 3 I'm allowed to surf, if only I could. The waves can look great, but once you get out there, let's just say I call myself a wannabe surfer. So here we are in one place, longing to be in another. And what might help us as we travel together? Well, I wondered if it might help if we had a look at the book of Exodus. It's about longing. It's about people caught in one place, actually in a much harsher place than our home bubbles. They are enslaved and captive. And while the book does have a passing interest in plagues, what it's really interested in is a journey of a whole people out from slavery and captivity, and then to them learning to live well. Gets served up in 3 parts. Chapter 1 to the middle of chapter 15 is about escape from slavery in Egypt, about the God who cares and leads them out of oppression. From the middle of chapter 15 through to the middle of chapter 18, it's about living in the wilderness, about discovering a God who provides. And chapter 19 to 40 are about learning to live a new way of living with God present. So the people of Israel, although they can't yet say that of themselves, they're on a journey too, and they don't start by knowing the full steps of it. So as part of this series, we'll provide a daily reading from Monday to Friday, put that up on our website, some small group or small bubble material for prayer, discussion, reflection, and some content on Sundays. And in the middle of Exodus, God will say to the people of Israel, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." And then he'll go on to say, "And of all nations, although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy or a peculiar nation." So it's worth noting that Exodus starts with fear and anxiety, pain and suffering. In fact, not just of the Jews. The man in charge, the leader of Egypt, is scared of these strangers in his land because they're growing and succeeding and getting power, and so he deliberately enslaves them. And Exodus says he makes their lives bitter, fills their lives with harsh labour. He even gets midwives to kill their male babies by drowning them in the Nile, which clearly establishes him as the baddie, which, as anyone who watches Hollywood movies knows, in the first scene or two, the villain has to kick the dog. Well, he's clearly kicked the dog. Which brings us to the reading. One day, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. "This is amazing," Moses said to himself. "Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go and see it." Well, that brings us to notice the place of curiosity, not knowing it all. Good for us, because this is a time when we don't know it all. We are kind of making it up as we go along, and so is our government. I think they're doing a good job of it. What would have happened if Moses had seen the bush burning and thought, meh, bushfire, who cares? No rescue, no exodus. Much as people would like having a faith to be about having all the answers, it's more often about journeying with questions and noticing the questions. That's the beginning point of lots of encounters with God. Asking, oh, what's that? What's going on there? And going to check it out. So Moses heads off to go and check it out. Exodus 3 verse 3. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer," the Lord warned. "Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Moses has an encounter with God. God called his name. It kind of makes sense to you if you've had some kind of spiritual encounter. Most Christians can look back on their life and point to times when I was very aware of a spiritual encounter. But what about if you're not? 20 years ago, a bit dated, I'll confess, a British survey came up with an odd result. One of the questions they asked people was, have you ever had a life-changing spiritual experience? Think of your answer for a moment. Have you ever had a life-changing spiritual experience? Well, their result was that 76% of people said yes to that. 3 out of 4. Since then, I've thought it's quite a good question to ask, though I'm not always brave enough. It's a difficult question to answer. We don't always have the language for a spiritual encounter. We stumble. Words like, I remember that time when my heart was beating 1,000 beats per minute, or all the hairs on the back of my head stood up. We struggle to find good words to talk about the spiritual. And in fact, many of us are uncomfortable talking about touchy-feely stuff. And yet, have you ever had a life-changing spiritual experience? Moses did. Maybe that's why Moses is asked to take off his sandals, to make him pause and remember. In fact, there's a funny kind of symmetry going on here. In the last verse of chapter 2, 4 words are used to describe God. So it's to describe the terrible position the Jews are in. And the words used are God listened and saw, and God was mindful, and God knew. And the word knew in Hebrew has the implication of acted. And there's a bit of echoing here. Moses sees, listens, pauses. And the next bit of our passage is about the knowing and acting. So let's read that. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. And then he names some of the people who were living in that land: the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Look, the cry of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. Moses' life-changing spiritual encounter. Well, it's not life-changing yet. It will be because now he has a calling, something to do, a journey to go on. And while he's promised a land of milk and honey, a spacious land, he has no idea where that is. And he doesn't know where he's going or how, much like us now. And much like us now, Moses has some concerns. He's anxious. In the next little scene, Moses will ask, well, who am I? And God's response will be, doesn't matter, I will be with you. And then Moses has a slightly cheeky response. He says, well, who are you? He doesn't say that. He says, look, I'm going to go and tell the Jews that you've told me this, the God of my ancestors, and they're going to say, who are you? And so he asks, who are you? And God replies with the I am. And in the discussion that goes on, Moses continues to be caught up in his worries and anxieties. He says, what if they don't believe me? He says, I'm not a good enough speaker. And maybe he isn't. Maybe he's not the great hero we want him to be, but then the plan was not that Moses delivered the people, but that God would deliver the people using Moses. So, there's some things we can see from this. What's God's response to injustice? Well, God calls people. It's often been reflected, God could have supernaturally led the people out, but he chose to use a person. God's response to pain and injustice is to use us. So what? What should we do? Well, notice what you're curious of. Explore it. Why not set an alarm on your phone to remind you once a day just to stop and say, have I seen God at work? Some of us might need to walk around the block to slow down enough to do that. And then if you've spotted something, pause, take off your sandals. And lastly, relax. If Exodus is to be believed, then God knows, listens, sees, cares, and responds to our pain and suffering. This is a strange time. There is a lot of anxiety and worry out there and in here. But that won't stop God using Moses, and it won't stop God using us to help others, if we allow God to. And at this stage, God, we pray for you to lead us on a life-giving journey through the wilderness to a land that is spacious,